Great. Okay, let's go ahead and get started then. So my name is Frances Hocutt. That's my Twitter up there, and I'm going to be talking to you about a developer's eye view of API client libraries. So the idea here and where I really want this talk to go is to give people the, if you're trying to pick a client library to use yourself, I want to give you some guidelines for things that you can look at and make that decision in an informed way with an eye to usability. If you maintain or write client libraries of your own, then I hope that you can take from this talk some things that you can do to make your library easier for as many people to use as possible. So I'm going to start off with some introductions and some sort of assumptions I'm going to be making for this talk. I'll just run through a couple of things that you make using web APIs, some reasons why you might be wanting to use a client library, and then I'll get to the meat of it, which is the features of a usable API client library. I'll talk a bit at the end about developer experience and how that plays into library design, and I'll just mention a handful of resources at the end. I believe these slides will be up online, so you can follow up on the links later. All right, so get started. So I already gave you the sort of what I hope you can bring out of this talk. I want to hear a little bit more about you all, though, and what your background is. So raise your hand if you know what an API is. Okay, cool. Raise your hand if you know what an API client library or client framework is. Okay, all right. Raise your hand if you've used an API for a project that you've worked on, personal or work or whatever. Cool. All right. Just trying to make sure that everyone has baseline. So how many of you have written or maintained a client library? Okay, so like a third of you. Cool. All right. All right, great. So a bit about me and why I'm up here talking about this. Last summer I was working on a project for the Wikimedia Foundation to try to make some sense out of all of the many third-party client libraries for the MediaWiki API. So I ended up looking at a few dozen of those, and as I was going through those, I started to notice some patterns about what things made me go, yes, these developers really have it going, and oh no, not another one of these. So as part of this project, I also put together and wrote a standard that's what the MediaWiki developers would like to see from these third-party libraries. And a big part of that is, we have this API. It's kind of it's powerful and flexible with all of the drawbacks that implies also. And we want people to use it, and a lot of people do, and we want it to be easy for people to get started interacting with our sites through this. So that's sort of where I'm coming from, and more generally, I really am a fan of having tools to do work for me. I'm really a fan of not having to read through pages and pages of instruction manuals before I can figure out which end to hold the tool so that it's going to work. And I want the software that I use to be as easy to use as all of the well-designed things that I use in everyday life. some basic assumptions with this talk. This is really geared towards third-party client libraries. You can use many of the principles if you have an API and libraries that you maintain yourself, but I'm going to assume that you're dealing with someone else's API. I'm not going to get into any hairy details of like RESTful versus non-RESTful, but if it's a question, just assume I'm talking about a RESTful API. And I'm also going to assume that that your goals are probably not the same as my goals, and presents just a way to set your priorities and make your decisions. Not everything that I go through here is going to be applicable to your particular use case, and that's great. So I'm going to just breeze through this bit. Most of you have already used them for something. So API is just another way that you can interact with the database over HTTP. So you can use them to write apps, desktop, mobile, what have you. You can use them for research. So you can use them to create the data sets that you need. Twitter, Wikipedia, Facebook. I know people who are working in all of these areas. You can use them to get the data for data visualization or data art, which is sort of taking the data as a starting point, less to display the truth of it and more to use it to make aesthetic stuff. You can use APIs are useful for mobile development. They're also useful for extending site functionality. So for something like Twitter, there's a lot of there's the blocking functionality on Twitter itself is not it's not necessarily suited for dealing with a massive flood of people you maybe don't want to interact with. So people have been developing applications like Flamingo, Block Together, and the Blockbot, where you can where it uses the API to make it so that you can interact with the site in the way that you want it to. Another really good example of this is Tumblr with SCaLE, which actually makes it possible to communicate on the platform. So you can use APIs for a bunch of things. Why use a client library? Why not just you know how to write code? You can deal with the API itself natively, right? And in a lot of cases, sure. But even with the best API possible, the best designed, the best documented, the best the most pleasant to work with, the most aligned with what you want to do with it, there still might be reasons that you want to use a client library. So sort of starting from, I'm going to go sort of from best API to APIs in this world that we live in today. So you may just not want to have to keep handling HTTP authentication, stuff like that in the client that you're writing. You want someone to have handled all of that stuff for you so that you can do more interesting things. You want to engage with the API at a different level of abstraction than the API is interested in providing to you. So an example of this is with the MediaWiki API, which is what you use if you want to, say, get information for a Wikipedia page in a Wikipedia article. Maybe you want to be thinking in terms of just get the text that's on the page. Maybe you don't want to be thinking in terms of, okay, I want the information about the most recent revision that's in the revision properties that's in the text. So maybe you just want page text. Maybe you don't want to have to think in that level of granularity. Maybe you want to, maybe the response that the API puts out isn't really consistent with the idiom of the language that you're working in. Also possible that the API, while it's, you know, in accordance with all the best practices of API design, maybe it just wasn't designed for your goals. So an example of this is the Facebook API. People who it's designed, as far as I can tell, it's designed to allow people to write apps for it and get as little extraneous data out of there as possible. So it has these arcane rate limiting rules. It's, you know, you can write apps, but if you want to use it for research, if you want to put together those big data sets, it's very difficult to do that just because that's not what Facebook would like to keep its data. Thank you very much. It's possible that the API wasn't really designed well. So in a lot of cases, I mean, it takes good design takes effort, and maybe the project that ended up putting out the API that you're using, maybe that was originally an internal API that, you know, developers at the company just sort of got used to how it worked, and then whoops, all of a sudden it's external before there's time to fix it, and you all as developers get to deal with that API. It's possible that it wasn't really designed as such. There are APIs that it seems like they just sort of grow. For instance, if you, I'm gonna pick on MediaWiki a little bit. The bulk of the API is a relatively thin wrapper over the database. So there wasn't really anyone sitting down and going, okay, we need to get this conceptually together. It was just, we need to have a way to programmatically get information out of the database. Here you go. And from there, you know, that's the original API didn't cover all of the functionality that everyone needed, so people keep on writing modules for it, and it just sort of expands from there. It's possible that the API was designed a couple of times. So this crossed my Twitter feed recently, and deprecation is a fact of life for dealing with APIs. And so the one thing that a client library can protect you from is that if the API keeps on changing on you, you can have, if you have a responsive library developer, they can keep up to date with all of the, you know, all of the functions that are not working anymore, or not working quite like you expect them anymore. And you can get on with writing your client and doing the fun things that you want to do. So I hope that I've convinced you that you don't necessarily just want to go with the API. A client library can help keep you from implementing the boring bits over and over again. It can make it so that your own code's more readable because you're able to write in your own idiom. It can take you to the level of abstraction that you want and again help with your own code's readability. And it can help you design around the pain points that pretty much every API has. So again, design is everywhere. This is, you know, those paths in the park where there's this perfectly nice, shiny path that they've provided, and then there's the way that people actually go. The client library can be that way that you actually go that'll get you there smoother and faster. But that's only true if the client library is itself designed and maintained with usability and with the developer experience in mind. So with that, I'm going to start talking about what a developer needs from a library and what the process of working with one is, and go into some detail on each of the points on each of the points where it's easy to introduce unnecessary friction to the process. What? All right. So these are the features of a usable API client library. It's easy to understand. You have a developer who wants to write an API client. And if she's lucky, she's going to have a lot of libraries to choose from. If not, might just be stuck with one. So how so before even getting started with working on with trying to download it, install it, make it work, see whether she wants to know whether it's even likely to work for the purposes that she's using it for. Once she's determined, yeah, probably, she's going to need to download and install it and just get started developing. She'll need to figure out how to use it to write the client. She's writing code. Code has bugs. It's one of those universal truths. It's going to need to be easy to debug. And since she's building on a library that someone else has generously provided to the community for them to be able to use, if she wants to give back or she wants to extend the functionality so it works for her project, it'll need to be easy to improve. All right, let's talk about easy to understand. The most important thing here is to have findable and accurate documentation. And I know, so for a lot of this, I realize that it may, we all know that there are best practices that we maybe should be following, and for whatever reason don't. And I mean, often that's a fine reason. But if we want usability to be a priority, then we need to make decisions that reflect that. So if your code is on GitHub and your documentation is on the old SourceForge site and there's no link from the current repository to the old documentation, you might want to fix that. If your documentation is mostly on the GitHub wiki, those little gray links on the sidebar are not very discoverable. Consider adding a link. The questions that we want to answer here are, I mean, they're really basic. They're what we hope to see, but I wish that these were on every single project. What does it do? What sorts of things is it good for? So in the Wikipedia libraries I was looking at, there are some frameworks that are just really light, like really light, shallow wrappers over the API that handle handle the HTTP, handle logging in, handle cookies, stuff like that. And those tend to be good for research, writing basic queries, and getting some data sets down. Maybe not so good for hardcore wiki maintenance, running bots that are going to be just going in and constantly fighting vandalism and reverting destructive edits and stuff like that. So you want to make the use case clear. And here also, just to save your users time down the road, make it clear which versions of the API it goes for. Another thing here, a signpost that'll let someone who's looking at your library know what it's good for. Have code samples. Give them an idea of what it's good for. If you do, document them. and make sure that they work, because any sample code that you provide is going to end up in someone's project. I guarantee it. And you will save, if someone downloads your library and tries to run the code sample and the sample doesn't even work, they're probably going to go, oh, I can't even get this to work. I'm not using this. There'll probably be more bugs in here. So there's for easy to understand. So we've decided, yes, this library looks fine. Now it's time to get started installing it and setting it up with the rest of your development environment. I have not met anyone who has told me anything of this sort, and I'm willing to bet that none of you have met this mythical person either. I would bet that somewhere in the infinite diversity and richness of human experience, they have to exist, but I'm not sure that I will meet them in my lifetime. So what does this mean for your library? So in general, installing things, fussing with command line tools, shaving yaks, this is thankless work. This is the work that you do so that you can get on with doing the fun stuff. People have, we've put together systems and sets of tools and as developers, we learn how these things basically work. So unless you have a really good reason to, and sometimes you do, take advantage of the existing packaging systems and the existing just sort of language ecosystem, and make it, if you're doing Python, make it so you can just pip install library and save everyone time. If you're really feeling fancy, package it for your Linux distribution of choice and let people install it that way. But don't. But a little bit of extra work on your end, if your library does end up being even moderately used, will save many person hours that could be better spent writing cool stuff. So your setup instructions, again, unless there's a really good reason not to, they should also work with common development practices. So it should be easy, for instance, to install into a virtual environment. There's one framework that I was looking at where I tried to do this, and before I could get it to run, I needed to, even in the virtual environment, I needed to have a configuration file in my home folder. I'm sure there was a good reason for this, but unless you have one, make it work like people expect. Even if all of that stuff sounded like too much work, that's a choice that you can absolutely make. That's you are under no obligation to do anything that I'm saying, but you also, this will get you like 80% of the way there. Include a getting started section so that people know just how to do it. So you've done all of this stuff before. Just install it on your own system really quick, copy what you did, and put that in your documentation, and that'll be so much better than the vast majority of what's out there. All right, so we've successfully installed it and gotten it running. All right, so a library that's easy to use should have enough features to make it worth using. In general, it should handle HTTP. It should handle authentication if that's a concern. You should have appropriate helper functions to handle the response in a way that's consistent with the language that you're using. It should follow principles of good API design, because when you write a client library, you're putting an API on top of another API. So API design principles apply to you as well. what are these? Well, it's a lot. It's going to sound really, really familiar to anyone who programs um, who programs themselves, because we are talking about code and abstractions of various forms. So yeah, naming. It's a hard problem anywhere in programming, but it's especially important when you are naming things that other people are going to be that naming things that other people are going to be using. So, for instance, one library that I was looking at, the way that you got the text that was on a wiki page was calling page.edit. I found this pretty confusing, and fortunately they decided to deprecate that and change that to page.text, which is much more descriptive and doesn't imply that there are, you know, side effects where you're actually editing and changing anything in the database. You also want to separate the layers of abstraction that you're working with. A really common pattern to is to have some portion of the library handle the underlying the basic API calls, and then you can have higher level stuff on top of that. So, for instance, I'm going to just give some examples from a library that I'm fond of. You have at the lowest level, the wiki site that you're interacting with. You have the API get token, so that's the CSRF protection token. You have helper functions that will just handle what that gives back, and then you can work on the page level where, you know, page.text, page.move, but you're not going to call, for instance, page.api. Keep these things conceptually separate, and then going one more level up, you're not going to have it's yeah, they've decided to separate the how images are handled distinct from pages. So again, this is standard programming best practices, but it's extra important when you're working with interfaces. Another thing, keep security in mind. If the API supports HTTP, which most of them these days are going to, make sure that your library can handle that. So some of the Python libraries that I was looking at were using an HTTP library that didn't support HTTPS. So all of the calls were going across the network just plain. Make your library's users aren't necessarily going to have security in mind. They just want to make something cool. So do that due diligence for them. It's be a good internet citizen. And on the internet citizen sort of thing, going like the sample code that you include, the defaults that you include in your code will somewhere between often and usually be left exactly the same. So set them consciously and make sure that they're good ones. If the API, if the folks who run the API don't appreciate getting calls over and over again, include a rate limiting function. If the people running the API want to see a distinct user agent, like Wikimedia likes to see from its wikis, make it possible for the client to change the user agent header. Make it easy. Good design is about making it easy for people to make good decisions. Okay, so there is so we've talked a bit about things that are going to help writing the code. Again, code has bugs, fact of life. How are we going to catch them? Um, write automated tests, and I know that I know that this is that APIs are obnoxious to write a full test suite for. But this is another one of those things where if you put in a little effort, it'll be a lot better than a lot of what's out there. So test the functions that are easy to test. Test the helper functions. Test the ones that don't actually require interacting over the network. And then at least if problems are happening, you can localize them to you can hopefully localize them to the ones that you didn't test and narrow the scope of where you're looking. Hacky code is a fact of life, and sometimes it is necessary. Sometimes you just need something that works. You have a really weird edge case. You have someone who's reported a really, absolutely bizarre bug, and you just want to put that patch in there and not have to think about it anymore. That's a totally valid choice. But when you do that, make sure, just write a note. So I really love the way that, again, this is MW Client handles this. So it's marked the workaround for a specific issue that was reported with the library. Gives the rationale for the workaround that it's using. So just sending an ASCII only dummy name just to keep weird encoding problems. And it shows it shows the end of the workaround. So this is if someone is running into a corner case with this fix, they know they can look at the code and see where to look at it and where to get started trying to figure out where that bug comes from. And also if you're like, okay, I have this really, really, really clever idea, just write a note that you're being really clever there. And people who come after you and your future self will thank you. All right, last feature of a usable API client library is that it's easy to improve. A lot of people, it's really easy to just pick a license. If you don't have particular opinions, and many of you probably do, but so I'm not getting into specifics. But if you want other people to work on it, put a license on the code that you write that invites contributions. Otherwise, just legally people won't. People will be less likely to contribute. Also, set people's expectations appropriately. So the bad case here is, someone has something that doesn't quite work for them for your library. They write a patch, they submit it to you, and then it sits there for 6 months before this maintainer, who I'm sure is no one in here would get super busy and just not even want to think about a project for a while, I'm sure. So if the library is under active development and is changing, make a note, say so. If the library is being maintained and you're fixing bugs, but you're not really adding new features, say so. If you're actively accepting patches, that's cool. Make a note. If you get really busy and you seriously can't promise to have any sort of response within the next 3 months, just say so. It's, you know, putting that out there respects your own time, which um, because you're deciding what you're actually willing and able to do, and it respects the time of potential contributors, because there's um, there's not much worse than trying to get involved and trying to contribute and just having your work vanish into a black hole and not go anywhere. Also on the note of setting expectations, if you're lucky enough that your client library develops a community of users and contributors, take responsibility and make that community welcoming. Set expectations for behavior. Consider having a code of conduct. There are some great ones for online spaces. I think Node.js and the Rust language are both examples that you can draw from. And make it, make like we're all hopefully here because we want to come together and make things. That's one of the things that I most like about open source and contributing to open projects, and just making sure that is the tone can go a long way to making the spaces that you're in, and you have a certain amount of pull in as a developer or a maintainer. Just set the tone. So there's the sort of story of this developer. Figure out if this library is even going to work for you. Get it going. Start messing around with it. Write the client that you want to debug as needed, iteratively, hopefully not forever, and extend and improve and contribute. The framing that I'm using to think about this is developer experience, and the idea is sort of like that picture of the shiny provided path and the path where people actually go, is to make the path that you're expecting as close to the path that people are going to naturally try to walk on as possible. So there's a concept in let's see. Yes, it's all design. You're making tools. Tools are wonderful. There's a concept in design called affordances. And if you look at the pull bars on these doors, you'll see that the designers here are not using affordances effectively. So the idea there is, you see a button, we expect to be able to push it. You see a handle, you expect to be able to pull it. You see a bar, again, you expect to be able to push that. So an equivalent for this library that you're writing, you see sample code, you expect to be able to run it. You see that it's apparently pretty normal Python library. You expect to just be able to get it from pip and have it up and running without too much trouble. A lot of one of the most liberating things about thinking about design in this way is that it takes it out of the realm of fault and not being smart enough to do things. So those doors. I'm sure that if I had to go through these every day, and I'm willing to bet if most of us in the room had to, we would still try to pull the door at least once a week, because that's what it looks like, and that's what we expect. And that's no fault in any of us. It's not that we're not smart enough to work a door. It's that the way that the door is designed is not congruent with our expectations of how a door should look and how a door should operate. And what that means is that if you're writing tools to be able to make it, writing tools that you hope will make their users do their work more effectively, faster, better, you're going to want to use their expectations, those affordances, in the direction that they're already expecting and moving, to guide people to do what you think they ought to be able to do with the library. In general, tools that are designed with respect and empathy for the user end up being the most effective because they're the most effectively aligned with where people are coming from and what those expectations are. And when the user, or in this case, when the developer, doesn't need to sort of step back and go, oh, I forgot, there's that thing that never works like I expected, the tool can get out of the way, the library can get out of the way, and people can just use your stuff to make awesome API clients. So a couple of resources. I'm not actually sure who put together the developer experience blog. It's a little bit on the older side, but it has a lot of really good links on developer experience. There's also the standard that I developed and got buy-in for last summer. That's at API client code. That's that's a lot of what I took the easy to understand, use, etc. framing from. There's a really excellent paper from Jasmine Blanchett out of, I think, Nokia, that with API design principles. The post on harm reduction for developers is also useful in the context for this, because all of these things that I've been saying are good for usability and everything. All of these take work, and I don't want to be like, oh, well, you could just make your library usable. No, these are actually in some cases significant effort. She has some really good framing about how to get that sort of like 80% of the way there to make to sort of get as, not best practices, but better practices. And finally, John Musser has a talk on why developers hate your API, which is possibly not the framing that I would take, but has some really good, like, if you've been working with APIs, you will understand and appreciate the points that he makes there. So before I take questions, I'd like to acknowledge the folks that I was working on, that I was doing a lot of this work with. My mentor for last summer, Simona Hariharishwa, and Talif Faghin, and other developers I was working with, Brad George and Merline Van Dien. And thank you all for your attention, and I will be happy to answer questions.
So when you have a Google website and provide REST API, I've seen two problems that occur quite commonly. Either things are misnamed between the website and the API,
Mm-hmm.
have an internal concept, or a lot more commonly, there's a different level of detail. On the website, they have a few basic concepts. When you hit the API, it's like 3 extra tiers of detail.
Yes.
How would you go about handling that if you're running a client API? Do you extract that stuff, or do you continue to go to the low-level API?
So the question is, if you have a mismatch between the level of detail that the API provides and the level of detail that the website provides in either direction, but you're saying more commonly in the website gives you some basics and then the API gives you all of the details. How would you handle that? And I think I would, I would say that this comes down to what you want the library to be used for. So if you're writing something that's intended for like um, really complicated, detailed data set collection, then you probably want to keep all of those details in place. If you just want something that's going to, let you write a client that feels like the website, then you probably want to abstract that away. Yeah.
I have like an application I'm working on where the team that it's database driven and the team really has no common language. Like the web developers are PHP and the data scientists are like MATLAB and the systems programmers are like C, Python, Bash, that kind of thing. So we just created an API
Hmm.
as functions and procedures in the database. Have you
Okay.
ever seen that?
Um, I haven't, but I've done a lot more working with APIs than I have developing sort of the underlying machinery for the APIs themselves. But
Yeah, I mean, it's usually, it seems like since the advent of like Rails and such, like
yeah,
the use of the database as an application in itself is sort of abstracted often, not used very much. So we just sort of went the opposite way.
yeah, that's interesting. Oh.
What about what about avoiding breaking backwards compatibility?
Mm-hmm.
When you try to value function, for example,
Yeah,
should we pick them or should we rename it or should we create a new one?
yeah,
And that leads to our versioning.
yeah. Oof, that's so the question is, um, if you have a bug or something that you want to fix or improve, how does that work with backwards compatibility and versioning? And yeah, API versioning is kind of one of those things that easily turns into holy wars. But the approach that I like is warn and deprecate. So if you have something that that should be renamed for clarity, you know, have keep it for a while. Mark it as deprecated, both in and if you can have it emit a warning or an error or something when you use it to give people time to get used to the idea that they might need to fix things at some point. That's the approach that I like. There are certainly others. Yeah.
Speaking of deprecation and going back to your example of Google, have you read the Steve Yeagy rant on Google APIs versus Amazon?
No, I haven't, but possibly I should.
Yeah, I mean, the reason Google APIs are so, there's so much churn is is a everything's publicly accessible,
Mhm.
whereas Bezos could say to all the different teams, we have to make APIs, and they'd have like years to do it internally.
Mhm.
So whenever you look at the Amazon webpage, nobody really knows where all of that stuff's coming from. It's just like 10 different APIs that all have been forced to work together through
Mhm.
extensive testing.
Mhm.
And somebody sort of does top level QC on the
Yeah.
testing, but then it all goes down underneath. Whereas Google, I mean, it's much more, they're
Mm.
making the APIs for external users,
Yeah.
so they don't get the blast off sort of benefit.
Yeah. Hmm. All right. Last. Um, not. I mean, I am generally in favor of openness and letting people do interesting things with data, but that's my general bias. All right, thank you all very much.